All right, we're ready to get started. Thanks everyone for joining today. We're really excited to have a great turnout and to have some really expert panelists here today to talk about branding. So I'm AJ, I'm gonna be moderating today, and I'm gonna give each of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. I just hit record on the session, so we'll have a recording available afterward as well. And to kick things off, John, would you like to kick off your introduction?
I'm sorry, could someone step down? John, you said you need?
Yeah, would you like to go first, introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is John Paulson. I am the brand and marketing strategist here at HMG Creative here in Austin. We are a full digital agency here. We do brand story, marketing strategy, web development, web design, development, and marketing execution. So.
All right, great. And Kristopher, would you like to go next?
Sure. I am Kristopher Bolleter. I am a freelancer, pretty much full-time. I work for a number of great agencies, and small and large, and do a lot of political work here and there as well. Websites is pretty much my niche. I like to really custom tailor the experience to the client, and really brand focused, on conversion goals first and foremost.
Great. Excited to have you. Alix, let's have you go next.
Hey everyone, it's Alix. I am the proprietress of AlixCompany. See, my name says AlixCompany, so I guess that's not too far of a stretch. I am a brand planning leader, and I specialize in consumer market research. I've been operating as AlixCompany for about 12 years. We do three things really well: qualitative market research, quantitative, and we also have a planner for a while service where you can contract time on a consulting basis. Work with all sorts of clients, and experience runs the A to Z spectrum, as you saw in my bio, probably from American Airlines to ZICO coconut water. We have a couple of services specifically designed for e-commerce and retail. One of which is really funnily named 1-2-3 Strategy. It's fast and efficient. So really looking forward to hearing from you guys. Definitely want to talk and share know-how, but also use the comments to the right to share your questions, because we want to make this as tailored for your needs at this time, especially with the importance of e-commerce and retail. So thanks, Lori. Thanks, AJ. I'm really thrilled to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Great. I'm glad to have you.
Join us.
And Mason, if you could do your introduction.
Hi, Mason Arnold. I'm a serial entrepreneur here in Austin, Texas. My current company is called CC's Veggie Co. We make pasta out of fresh vegetables on a machine and platform that I invented with my engineering background, and we're nationally distributed in most major retailers.
Excellent. We're really excited to have a diverse group of folks to answer our questions today. And as we mentioned, please use the chat for any additional questions or if you have any clarification of anything we're talking about. But to kick things off, Alix, if you could answer this question first. Branding is how you're remembered and how you're perceived. How can e-commerce businesses build their brand? Where should they start?
I think it's a great question, and some of these questions I might add a little different perspective and try and reframe the question. Can't help it, you know. I would say the branding is how you are. So not only is it how you are remembered and how you are perceived, it's how you are. And I think as we continue the conversation, there's a question later, for example, about employees and framing, employer action so that employees are aware of the brand. I think sometimes employers have to be aware of the employees as far as a reflection of the brand. So just a couple of little tweaks on things. The first one being branding is how you are. I'm a big, huge proponent of research and using data to inform decisions. However, and especially these days, not only have I been getting on the phone more and talking to customers and clients, but I'm also been recommending people get on the phone. I know that sounds really simple, but as far as where to start, I always recommend that clients start by talking to people, by talking to your customers, by talking to competitive customers, by talking to product and your concept lovers and haters, looking at every realm to really get to know what we might call the culture or the universe of your business. So your branding to start to absolutely be grounded and forever centered on those sorts of insights.
Thanks, Alex. Mason, what would you give in terms of advice for where brands should start?
I mean, I would just echo what she just said. It's about research. And when I launched CC's VeggieCo, I did about 6 months of research into consumers. I even did what I call the bootstrap focus groups, where the only thing I was a professional facilitator, but I put them in my dining room with 10 people and put a drop cam there. And then I was in the other room watching the focus group. And so I think researching and authenticity. So as she said, it's who you are. So I think you have to be true to, you know, kind of your own values and personality, and then, you know, create something, you know, engaging for the consumers.
Absolutely. I was just going to add, I mean, obviously, I think like Alex mentioned, you know, tapping into your audience has got to be the first part of really, you know, building your brand and really figuring out what those goals are and what they're looking for, what your products and what your mission is. I mean, it starts with your vision, but tapping into your audience, I mean, they are ultimately the biggest extension of your brand. They're going to be your biggest brand ambassadors. And I think there's something to be said about, you know, having that audience be really central to building a real movement for your brand.
I'll chime in a little bit. Branding, in my mind, I think totally different. In my mind, branding, whether it be visual or mostly non-visual brand, is what I work on. But branding is about story. Marketing is about strategy, in my mind. And so I think my advice would be to start with your story and not think of it as a strategy. You know, I think the basics at the beginning. I'm an entrepreneur. I was a previous entrepreneur as well, and I made the mistake of wondering what my customers want when I was building my brand. And really, what that does is it starts me off on the wrong foot. I mean, if I'm gonna have a vision of what I want to do, or what I want to sell, or the products or services that I may want to offer, I'm not saying we don't go out and do market research, but I mean, first step in branding in my mind is figuring out what your vision is, what mission are you on, and then when you add other people, build guiding principles that then build the culture around what it is that you want to do, and then live or die by it. I mean, so when it comes to marketing, yes, where are you going to get your customers? How do they feel about your product? Things like that. But honestly, I don't, not that I don't want to talk to customers, but I don't really, I use the analogy of opening a furniture store that sells just green sofas. And if that's my love and that's what I want to do, and I believe in it so much, then customers that come in and ask for brown sofas, I'm going to be the expert and say, hey, go to Larry's down the street because he sells brown sofas, but I'm just into green sofas. And I want them to ask me why, why are you just selling green sofas? And then I can tell my story. So when it comes to branding, in my mind, it's about the story. It's not about a strategy.
Absolutely.
I think there's definitely a human element, and the story piece brings in the intangible, whereas the strategy perhaps brings in, you know, frameworks and whatnot. I think it's a nice tap into the emotion to understand the vision within that story. I just am a real big proponent of carrying the consumer, whether it's the vision or the truth, and how that links perhaps with the Venn diagram into what's going on in the world and other things. So don't disagree with you at all, but just would nudge folks to start by keeping an ear to the ground alongside knowing, you know, what their business is and finding out to customers through and through. When you get off of that, your strategy and your execution and what you're doing with your story can be not connected.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and I heard several things mentioned in there, so I'd love to hear some opinions around. I heard the word vision. So what does vision mean to you? What should e-commerce and retailers be thinking about in terms of their vision?
I think obviously a vision is going to be unique depending on the brand, depending on if they're a product or a service, but ultimately, identifying the vision and how, again, I think, sorry, I lost, to his point about the story and everything, I think that's obviously a good place to start, and, identifying your unique vision, but ultimately, the vision is, both short-term and long-term, and how you can resonate with your audience. And that's why I said specifically audience, because the vision is really about captivating, for most people, I think they want to captivate the largest number of people possible. I mean, if there is someone with a very niche, service, they want to develop the green couch or the green whatever, and that's all they do, that's great. But there is a way to also tap into that audience, and also, in addition to the marketing, as you alluded to with your story, portion, there is a way to resonate that brand with your audience that is already may not be aware of, green couches, for example, making sure that your brand instills and is memorable, and also instills that vision into your audience and resonates with them is I think probably the biggest part to the brand, and also central to that vision question that you were asking.
I would agree with that. I think that, we talked about the first layer, I think. And so, their strategy can come after. I just think that strategy, sometimes the thought of strategy can muddle up the story. So I'm not saying there isn't strategy, or we don't talk about persona definitions and things that go along with strategy. What I'm getting at is that first base layer of being true to what it is, the culture you're trying to create. If you hire more people, that was my biggest issue when it came to my life as an entrepreneur, is that I got to the point where I was so big that I couldn't tell the story anymore. So therefore I had to create culture, and culture is what tells that story, right? And so marketing folks use those ideas, the vision, the mission, those things to tell the story through strategy. So yeah, I don't sound like we're disagreeing at all. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just talking about the very first layer of branding. And a lot of times people have to go back and revisit it. I did. I was 4 years in, and I didn't realize that, okay, wait, I don't know vision or mission. I was just worried about buying stuff at this price and selling it at this price, right?
Right.
So, that's the biggest lesson that I learned personally, was that first layer of branding is being true to your idea, or, as Simon Sinek says, your why. So I think that's really the core of what drives everything beyond that. So
absolutely.
I think it kind of reminds me of the Jim Collins Venn diagram of what you're passionate about, what you're good at, and what drives the economic engine. So I think you have to consider all three, but the vision comes from that passion, really.
And it is all connected. Mission, I think John talked about, is right above vision, and then values and tactics. So some of these constructs are really helpful as frameworks, and some aren't. We're in an age now where you can make your own, or you can use what exists. And as a creative person, we tend to mix and match. But the traditional structure is mission, vision, values, and tactics. And so tactics are those things, that you move forward with in terms of actions, or activating the brand and activating that story that we were talking about.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah, I think Mason, you said you were a serial entrepreneur, right? So you've probably gone through many ideas in your head, and you've gone through the vision, you go through the mission of where you're going to go, or the mission that the organization needs to be on, before you even, get out of the shower or get out of bed, wherever the idea hits you, right? And then you start doing the ROI in your head, and you go, okay, all right, will customers do this? I'm not saying that process doesn't work. I just say, when you go to build it and you realize that, yes, I can make money at this, or an organization can make money at this and survive, go back and think about what the pain point was and talk about that. I think great brands do that.
Yeah, agreed.
And taking us back a couple steps, I heard mention of the word persona, and we did get a question around how important is the exercise of creating a customer persona, and where does it fit in? When should you be building one, if you should?
I feel like you build the personas after kind of that first real traction. At first, you just have to throw something out there and see if anyone is willing to exchange money for the idea. And then once you get enough people who say yes, then it's like, okay, who are these people? Because for them to find me when I didn't exist before means they can be evangelists and they're early adopters of something. So then you take those people and say, what do they all have in common? Now, how do I go reach the people that are like them that maybe are not the early adopters and build an audience from there?
There's a practical, there's two pieces of it, right? One of the questions was, how do you, on the chat was on how do you, how do you communicate your mission, vision, values without copy or words? And I think, visually, if you make an X, on the left side is all of this behind the curtain stuff. It's the suspenders that are holding up your pants or the slip under the dress. No one really sees it if done correctly, in my opinion. Sometimes, sure. But for the most part, it's behind the curtain. The middle part is the pivot into creative. It's the creative brief we call, as we're working with creative teams. And then to the right is that articulation. It's the activation. It's how it lives and breathes and, looks from inside of the curtain. So personas are a constant thread, I think, throughout the process. I'm consumer girl, so it's constant throughout the process. However, personas get into the other side in front of the curtain, in my opinion, and how creatives start to communicate tonally, how creative teams start to put ingredients into an actual cook, which is different. And so personas are great. They should be on your mind from the beginning, as the consumer should be. But the real genius of personas and segments is for the creative teams to tap into that audience correctly, tonally, and also based on your business and marketing goals. And it's also practical because if you're buying media, so if you're buying any outbound communications, those persona attributes are linked to the media buy, sometimes very specifically with your demographics and your psychographics. So lots of usefulness, in my opinion, for personas.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that patience when it comes to persona definition as well. A lot of times you define personas, and I like to rate personas in the area of I hate sports analogies, but I always use spectators and fans, right? So you have a fan of a football team, and you take a friend with them, right? The one knows all the players, knows all the vision for the organization, knows the mission, knows all the products, knows all the services. But then there's the spectator, right? That has is willing to go because they enjoy that type of product. But like you said, they're like-minded, or they're people that like things. So I always figure out, as far as fans and spectators, I try to define personas in that manner. So therefore, spectators might take a little bit longer for them to kind of warm up a little bit, right? So we have to, in a marketing strategy, we would have to then talk to them in a different way, or maybe talk to them more often, right? So that's all common sense, right? But when I talk about them, I talk about spectators and fans. But I think persona-wise, and how that defines that is, like a great example of that is, and I know that Apple is always used when it comes to branding and things like that. But I think it's great because when we talk about personas, their number one persona from day one was creative people, right? I mean, the whole idea behind a Mac was to take fonts and not make them on the printer, but in the computer themselves, right? And for so many years, they used, the only people that used them were creatives, right? But now what's happened is they have users that would have never used a Mac before doing spreadsheets and Word documents and things like that on Macs now. So what they've done is they've embraced that persona of a creative person, and then just kind of built products that allow those people to think they're, oh, hey, we're creative, so we're going to move into that persona. So I think personas are really defining. And I think that just because, like when you start to define them out, 4, 5, 6 of them, whatever you want to do, that really, like, don't get hung up on that's only 1% of my audience, because it may be, depending on your vision and the mission you're on, that might be a giant persona for you later on. So think about how they align. Mason talked a little bit about return on investment and the, you know, whether the product can pay for itself, you may hit these two personas here to pay for your product while you roll, but then you head back to your brand story to create this other one, and it becomes this giant, you know, mushroom of business. So.
Great. So in terms of once a business has a brand, or they're starting to understand, are people aware of our brand? Is our brand effective? How do you know? How do you know if people remember the brand or if they are understanding it?
Well, I think that's something you can obviously track tangibly. I mean, with analytics and everything that we have available these days, I mean, data isn't a subjective thing. I mean, that's something that we can look at interactions with your brand at least from a digital perspective on the website, or any of your e-commerce or anything retail related that way. Even physical, there's so much crossover now with all of the localization that you can do. Specifically hospitality groups that I work with, they know if that person came from an ad and how they engaged with that brand first and foremost from the moment that they walk into that hotel, for example. So again, there's so much that is, from a data perspective, it's just no longer a question of whether or not it's a subjective answer. I mean, it really is something that you can look to and kind of define how people are engaging with your brand, whether it's effective, and where you can kind of tweak and kind of slowly optimize that experience.
And Alex, you had mentioned early on that that's where you start, is with data and measurement. So do you have anything you'd want to add to how you think about measuring brand awareness and effectiveness?
You know, it's certainly part of the pie, and starting could very well be with the business idea. So I'm correcting myself if I said that. I think market research is always a piece of it. You know, I think the strategy part of brand is about understanding those things that you can't understand. I think the brand part is the stuff that you can't understand, and the emotional stuff. So lots of different structures and frameworks. I like to use ACUP, easy to remember, and awareness, consideration, usage, and preference. And so to Chris's point, there are absolutely things you can do to understand as you're hitting each point and you know, marking each pivot. You guys have probably heard of journey mapping. It's certainly a way that you can do it, because you map out the behavior and the goal and what's going on. And absolutely with analytics on Facebook and Google, you can see where people are going and how they're getting there. Lots of different ways to track these days. But I would also say to keep, you know, ear to the ground on the intangibles and the brand part, because that's the living, breathing, moving part that's so wonderful about branding. And what goes beyond just, you know, just pure strategy, if you will. Brand strategy is lovely because it's both trackable and not trackable. And the not trackable stuff is sort of future forward, that you want to not pass up when you're thinking about how to establish advocacy or preference.
And we have an audience question for Mason. So the question from Jessica is, I have a product that is typically enjoyed while out or at an event, but I'd like to bring it into their home. With launching a product that is new to the market like yours, how did you educate the consumer about the product?
So my product in particular, I knew that retail was going to be the primary channel. It's a highly perishable produce item, and so D2C is not really a viable channel. And so for my product, I wanted to make sure that when someone walked by it, I caught their eye, and I knew I had about 3 seconds to convey enough information to get them to pick up the package and then turn it over and read the back. For things like, you know, a new product that if it was an event type product and you want people to bring it into their home, if retail is not the primary channel, I would try to find people where they will be receptive to it online. So maybe interstitial advertising in YouTube or podcasts, or you know, some targeted campaigns to find people that are searching for things that the product pairs with or is very useful to them. I also want to, I'd love to get the rest of the panel's input on that. But the question just before as well is how important is personal brand of the founder? And I think that's a really interesting one that I have been doing a lot of thinking about over the last several years. CC's VeggieCo, the intent of the whole thing was to grow the product company and sell it. And so I didn't want it to be too tied to my personal brand. The story is authentic. My kids had to go gluten-free, and I did a bunch of research to find products for them. So that I think the founder's story is certainly important to it, but I didn't want it to be overly connected to my personal brand, because when we sold it, the acquirer would want me to stay on longer if it was really tied to that. But especially for I think for e-commerce and product businesses going forward, there's just it's so low, the barrier to entry with product companies. I just last year I finally put together my website, masonarnold.com, and I'm starting to make sure that I gather all these data points that I haven't been documenting to kind of build my personal brand and my personal brand story. And I anticipate that whatever business I do next will have to be tied to my personal brand in order to convey that trust, because there's so much out there now. And I think trust is a really important factor moving forward, and personal brand is a big part of that.
Any other panelists have any thoughts on personal brand as it relates, how much your personal brand should be incorporated?
I think it's important. I think Mason talked about trust. I think authenticity has been mentioned as well. I'm AlixCompany LLC. The ALIX has always been unique and distinctive, and certainly did a round of exploratory to see if it should be something else, but just went with it and have stayed with that. So I'm obviously a fan. Different reasons for different angles, and certainly trust and authenticity need to be incorporated regardless.
Yeah, I mean, as a freelancer, I think for me, I'm always going to be personally branded. I never really wanted to like sub-brand myself underneath like a company. I don't know, just personally, I thought, I mean, maybe it was the authenticity. I guess I never really thought about it as a question from that perspective. But I know for all of the organizations that I work with, I've worked with, people who are much more, founders are much more involved, kind of to Mason's point. I mean, whether it is a story that's directly correlated with the significance of the brand and how it was developed, I mean, there is merit to kind of adding that personal aspect, because that's really what resonates with audience, specifically in that kind of that industry as well. I'm assuming, Mason, that story resonates with your audience, and having that story be directly connected to a real person, I think there is tangible, aspects to that help the brand kind of really resonate with the audience and do more with the brand as well. But then on the same scale, there's other brands who founders aren't necessarily directly tied to the organization, or they don't necessarily have as much relevance with the story. Maybe they're just selling a product or a service that doesn't directly have anything really, sentimental or any personal value to that. I think it really just depends on, with the product and the service as well.
And kind of pulling back a level, what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you see that people have about branding? And we'll start with you, John.
I touched on it a little bit earlier, calling it a strategy. I mean, yeah, I believe brand story and marketing strategy are two totally separate things. They have a little bridge that runs across them. I'm not saying there's not, but I believe that when we have clients come in, we do workshops with them, and when I get them off of the idea that it's about a strategy, that it's about how, like, what is the pain point? Mason, you talked about the pain point being that their kids were gluten-free. Like, what is the pain point, right? So what's the pain point? The pain point was probably you couldn't find products that they liked, or whatever whatever that is. I think that's not a strategy at that point. It may be a strategy in the back of your head rolling over. Can we sell this? Can we make money at this? What's the cost? That kind of thing. But from the standpoint of branding itself, non-visual branding, in my mind, it's just not a strategy. And so when you go, I never tell clients to go into it that you're thinking about strategy. Leave strategy out. It will come back in. It will come in. Like, we'll incorporate it. There is strategy involved, but I guess my hang up is the biggest thing is between the word story and strategy. And so that's what I try to instill in people who are either coming to us for new brand story, trying to get us to discover it, or trying to revisit it.
Yeah, and a similar point to that is what people conflating brand and culture. And you can have a very different culture than the brand, and you can have almost nonsensical, but the people working together and the culture and everything is able to execute on the strategy around this brand.
Absolutely.
I think it's a nicely said with brand story and marketing strategy and differentiating the two. I don't. I think brand strategy and obviously marketing strategy are completely different. I think what's neat about it, John, is that it's a foot in, right? Like, your brand story is an intention, if you will. So that's a neat construct that you use. I'm going to stay true to brand strategy, because the way that I've just in terms of this conversation, just because brand is the artful, tangible, movable, and strategy is also tangible, but it's the frameworks and whatnot. And of course, the story can come before or after that. The way I made some notes before the conversation, because AJ was fabulous and shared the questions with us before, but I think just at a macro level, it's just a lack of knowledge. I mean, you can see even us here on the panel are calling the same thing in different ways in some cases, and that can be really confusing. So the biggest deal is to get, a foundation, and we can certainly share some of our go-tos and, how we cut our teeth in terms of knowledge. But for me, it's just a lack of knowledge, and then the misinterpretation of branding. It's not a logo. It's not a website. Those are all activations or articulations. It's all baked into it. And the brand is the beacon of those things. But, it's not, brand strategy is not media strategy. Brand strategy is not business strategy. So knowledge and misconceptions within that, and making sure that the foundational knowledge as far as goals and what it can achieve and what it can achieve is the biggest deal, in my opinion.
I think you bring up a great point with like the beacons being the logo and kind of the website, for example. I think that's another, real big misconception when people kind of launch a brand, is they ultimately distill this entire brand ecosystem into a logo, or they just distill this entire thing down into a website. And they kind of think that that's like a catch-all, like, okay, now I've got a logo, but they don't really put even some of the foresight, kind of like Mason alluded to. I mean, really with his packaging and how he kind of needed that logo to resonate within that very quick time period to get people to engage with his brand. Most people don't make a lot of, at least from my experience and people that I've engaged with, they don't make a lot of those careful considerations about where that brand is going to be utilized and how that brand is going to kind of blossom, because it starts as an infant. It just starts as this idea. And I think most people just materialize and somehow distill this entire idea into a logo. And now once they have a logo, and there's so much more to it than just that logo or just that website and just that one action that you put into place, like you said, is beacons. There's so much to it.
And as the company grows, I think it's fascinating that, the audience and the customers actually become part of the brand as they interact, and as they become evangelists. The brand changes in a way to where you can no longer discreetly define it. It's just, you put guardrails around it, and you want to make sure it doesn't go off in some weird direction, but it becomes a living organism.
Yeah, I agree completely.
That's a great segue to one of our audience questions. So Jace Payne, I'll let you unmute. We have a question about moving from 4 markets to multiple markets and how your brand strategy can change or messaging can change around that.
Sure. So just a quick rundown on Biloxi Shrimp Co. and our brand. We actually merged 2 companies one being a brand of shrimp and then the other being a processing company, into Biloxi Shrimp Co. They were already Biloxi Freezing, but you know, they wanted to make an e-commerce store, and our firm decided that it would be best for them to brand themselves with a new fun name for the most part, as well as have a vintage feel to the brand. So that's where we came up with that, as well as this client, their families have been in the shrimping industry in Mississippi for 100 years. And so it's an awesome story to tell. You know, we really wanted to touch on that in our brand and, you know, make it vintagey, make it feel that, you know, obviously this family has been doing this for 100 years. They know what they're doing. And in our markets right now, I'm only advertising on social media. We're in, for the most part, we're only in the southern states. I'm in Dallas, Nashville, Atlanta, and Charlotte right now. And things have been good, and we've had good, you know, comments regarding, you know, the look of our branding. There's just been a lot of great things. I guess my question is, we're doing very well in these markets, kind of infiltrating them, you know, and really blitzing them hard. And my client has mentioned potentially going to 10 to 15 markets at a time. And I just don't, you know, the budget is not necessarily a problem, but it's a matter of strategic phasing with branding. And so, you know, I guess that would be my overall general question. Is there a spot in this, with this being a brand new brand from Biloxi, Mississippi, you know, going to 15 different markets and trying to tell that story so widely?
I think it's a really cool story. And so I think in any market, it would resonate, but I'm very much a fan of going deep before going wide. So picking one market and making sure that you have strong brand in that market before moving on.
Yeah, and you can glean from that. I think there's a business side of this too, right? As far as protecting assets. So I think as you continue to grow, it might make business sense to have different entities for different reasons. From a marketing perspective, look into a branded house versus a house of brands. So a branded house, you know, being one name, and that's consistent throughout. And then you have the permission, if you will, to do different things, but it's all under that brand. And then the house of brands is different brands, but all umbrellaed, perhaps under, you know, the master brand. So different entities of that. But from a marketing perspective, look at house of brands and branded house, and then also consider, you know, the different implications from a business perspective on creating separate entities as far as protecting assets and whatnot.
I would just add that I think it's all about your persona definitions. So if there are markets where you have high percentages of folks that are in your persona definitions and the messages that go out to those particular personas, then I would, then roll the dice based on the business decision. Yeah.
And congrats on the growth.
Thank you. Thank you all for your answers. Yeah, the client's getting, we've shipped to over 15 states in the last 3 weeks. And so he's starting to, you know, obviously be the client and ramp things up. And I'm like, all right, look, we got a good thing going. Let's keep phasing and telling our story. So I appreciate y'all's time. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. So, you know, we are in the year of 2020. There's a lot happening in the world. How would you recommend that brands or companies think about their brands in this COVID environment and with everything else happening in 2020? What adjustments should they be making?
I mean, I think it gives an opportunity for certain brands to tell a story in a different way, to create content based on story. If your story is related to, you know, safety, security, you know, things like that, I think it just gives an opportunity to tell your story in a different way. You know, from a marketing standpoint, I think we can relate it back to, you know, what we just talked about, which is, you know, people are shipping fresh seafood all over the country, right? They did 15 different markets. So I think that, the other thing too that I was telling someone today is that video content now is, we've just lowered the bar, right? Because it used to be that, this background would not have been an acceptable way to put out content, but now we can put content out with, t-shirts and shorts on. So think about it think about as we move on, right? As we move, I won't ask all of you to stand up to see if you have actually long pants on. But what I'm saying is that as that content moves, or as that bar gets lowered, you could step above the bar just slightly, and therefore and then have an impact. So I think that definitely has changed from a marketing strategy standpoint. If you have content and you want to do audio or video, just roll with it. Don't worry about that you don't have a white sheet behind you with it. You don't worry about that stuff anymore. Nope, nobody cares. Well, not nobody, but the bar's been dropped. So that's what I would say.
I think it's struck. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I think we've touched on some of it with tonality and authenticity. I also think creatively, right, to think about these successful businesses and opportunities for partnerships. Opportunities that maybe you wouldn't have thought of before, in terms of what COVID brings, and whether that's a strength or a weakness for your business. Make it a strength, and perhaps think of different ways to partner with those that are being successful right now.
Sure. And I think this is also kind of to John's point from a strategic perspective, but also from an implementation side of, with a brand, it really put everything digital, at least in this COVID time, everything digital under a magnifying glass. You look at every different industry from, restaurant organizations to e-commerce. Everything digital did experience peak usage in many respects. And I think that also translates to people being a little bit more forward thinking with how their brand is going to be implemented on the web, or anything digital for that matter. Again, restaurants now, digital menus, there's, the QR code has made a comeback, I think, as on restaurants, for example. That's one of those things that I think most people, took for granted previously from a digital perspective. You never really saw a digital menu at a restaurant, for example, but now it's commonplace because COVID has totally shifted that way the brand needs to navigate that situation. So again, I think just reevaluating it, the way that the brand is extrapolated across all of these digital ecosystems is going to be another big consideration now moving forward as well.
Yeah, if I can just add one more thing there, I think there's a long-term strategy. There's a long-term focus that's shifting. You're actually seeing some great data out of Gartner and Mark, where brand strategy is taking charge in terms of the most vital marketing capacity, even over analytics. There's some real-time things going on right now, and I'm happy to post those later in terms of the reports. But we're seeing this, important and attention to longevity, which brand strategy has always been forward and long-term minded. So that's really exciting as someone, as brand strategists, as brand storytellers, John.
Yeah, and to go back to the word that John had introduced earlier, this idea of like a bridge between branding and the marketing piece, we had a question from Michael, which was, what is your advice for incorporating brand and brand voice into content marketing?
I think when you successfully complete brand story, whether you do it in your head over 15 minutes or you do it through a workshop for 3 hours, what comes out of that is one thing we haven't talked about is brand differentiation. So whether they be a handful, 10 of them, if you're lucky, right? 3, if you're really concentrated. I think that when you talk about brand difference and you get that out of brand story, what happens is that's what you talk about, right? Those are your differentiators. No one can beat you up on those things. And so I think that that's where voice is defined, is through your brand differentiators.
I think you need to have a brief first and foremost. I talked about that X, where to the left is the behind the curtain stuff and to the right is the articulation or the activation. The point in the middle, that little center, is the opportunity for a creative brief. So it spans the gap between the left and the right, if you will, and what is on paper in terms of, you know, marketing or product or service brief into the creative territory. So absolutely put a star by the creative brief. Your partners that are working on content strategy and that are creating the strategy will know what that is, but it's also prevalent as a takeaway perhaps from this panel is a creative brief. It bridges the gap between what's on paper and how it lives and breathes in terms of content or anything, any articulation.
Yeah, and +1 for focusing on what's different, because that's the piece that's going to make the content most engaging.
Yeah, it's a big piece on the brief, and I'd go even farther and say distinctive. We talk about differentiation, but sort of a bigger deal, and what we tout is what makes it distinctive. I know that just seems like a little twist, but the point of distinction within being different. So different is a pie chart where you're part of it. Distinction is what stands out. And we'll talk a little bit about distinction in the brief as well as differentiation.
And a couple more questions before we wrap up today. So in terms of getting into action, so if you're a newcomer and you want to get the word out, what's the most efficient way to market with a limited budget so you can get the word out about your brand?
I think this goes back to, at least in the beginning question where we were kind of differentiating this might be strategic, John, but in your respect of really identifying the audience. I mean, again, in terms of efficiency, if you're really looking at, you know, optimizing an ROI, if you don't even have a marketing budget at all, identifying your audience and really pioneering those brand ambassadors, people who are going to be really behind your brand, people who are going to, you know, go on social media and say, wow, I just had the best shrimp of my life kind of thing. Those brand ambassadors are, again, just something that I think are really often overlooked as well when we're launching a business. And that's why I said early on that I think an audience is probably one of the most central pieces to that puzzle. And again, obviously, like Mason said, you know, when you launch your brand, you may not know exactly what that target audience looks like. It may kind of come out of left field. There just may be someone in a niche, version of that market who resonates most with your product, but finding those people and kind of lifting them up and lifting up their story about how they resonate with your brand can be probably easily the most efficient of launching a new brand right out the gate.
Yeah, I think the most nailed it, Kristopher. I think the most exciting data that's going to come out of kind of new technology is screen time. So I would love to know I would love to move the persona folks in a category up if they have higher screen times than others, right? Talking what you talked about, who are the people that are most likely to share it and say, this is the best shrimp I've had in my life, right? So those with high screen time numbers, I can't wait for that data to come. I'm sure, Alex, you being data driven as much as you are, that data right there, when that data becomes commonplace, it's going to be, I think it's a game changer. So yeah, Alex, or Kristopher, great point. Bringing those people to the top and hitting them first, I think is a huge deal.
Yeah, I would just add to, vet all options, lots of options that are less costly than others, especially right now. So definitely do that. Friends are fantastic to tap into if you're on a very low budget. Obviously, I don't do a lot of that, but I would recommend that in some of the classes and whatnot that we talk about when there's very limited amounts of budget. But yeah, certainly, do your homework on possibilities, and I'd be happy to share other ideas for folks joining us today in the comments or just outside of that. Lots of cost-effective ways to research and to go to market these days.
And I'm going to do a plug here for the Facebook group where there's a bunch of questions. Thanks everyone for your questions so far. And if we haven't gotten to it today, we'll move some of the conversations to our group. So I'll drop a link into that. I do want to ask one more question and then give each of the panelists a chance to talk about the best way to get in touch with them. So for the last question for today, what is your prediction for the role of branding over the next few years?
So I think this just kind of tapers off my previous point with digital being really kind of a focus point of kind of central to your brand. I think really just evaluating how the next few years is going to be. Again, it's all unforeseen at this point. Obviously, COVID is something that we've never experienced, but I think really just being future-proof with regards to the digital aspects of your brand, I think is going to be probably one of those biggest considerations in my opinion.
I guess I feel like in the coming years, I mean, the role of brand will stay rather consistent. I mean, it's the core of the company, and it's off of the vision and the story of the company. In food is an interesting one where retailers have been pushing harder and harder over time for private label products. And really what it just means is that they're trying to strengthen their brand in the consumer mind instead of the product brands. And in some categories that works, and then in some categories that doesn't work, and they have to backtrack. And most of them have very little understanding of why it works in some categories and why it doesn't work in others. And so it's been interesting to try to educate the retailers on, like, our category where the product is new, consumers don't understand it. They want that trust that comes from, you know, a discrete brand where we're the expert on this product. Versus the retailer that's just the expert on selling the product. And so I think that kind of, at least in food, that tension will continue. And I think it'll always just kind of be there'll be a tension there that we have to work out.
All right, well, with the last few minutes we have, I'd like to give each of our panelists a chance to give information about how you can be reached, and then we'll wrap up from there. Alex, you want to go first?
Yeah, and I want to answer the previous question. I don't know, being shy. But I think the next few years are going to be a real boom for creativity for everyone being on the panel, because it's super hot and even up future forward thinking for what's going on, you know, in the next few years. So thanks again, everyone, for having me. The best way to reach me is probably my email. It's Alix Morrow, Alix with an I, at AlixCompany.com. I've got a phone number as well, which is 512-537-8503. And we can happy to post that, you guys. And I'll send it in the chat, as everyone else is doing here, I see. So thank you again for the opportunity, everyone, and I will type in my info now.
Yeah, I put my info in the chat, masonarnold.com, and me at masonarnold.com.
Yeah, my info's in the chat, just John at hmgcreative.com. I think next steps, I'm sure all of you figured out how I'm going to answer this. I think story is going to be a huge piece. I think that, and I think that because of a couple different reasons. First is 5 years ago, there was the VC market, as far as allowing a brand that they invest in to go for a year to develop product, process, brand, things like that, would have been unheard of. You got to jump to market, get right to marketing strategy. Now, I mean, just in this last 10-year period, what's happened is they're allowing people to, hey, let's develop brand, let's develop strategy, let's develop these pieces before we go to market. So I really think that the piece of brand story, the idea of vision, mission, guiding principles that create culture, I think that is going to drive the front end of a lot of successful brands in the future.
Great, and my internet cut out, so if anybody didn't get a chance to share their information, please share it in the chat. Thank you guys so much for being our panel. This was very helpful. We look forward to continuing the discussion in our next month meetup, as well as in our Facebook group. So a virtual high five to all of our panelists, and thank you guys for being on today and sharing your expertise.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, it was awesome.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.